Going back as early as possible, we get the earliest mentioned lore in Kildane reassignment. In this interaction, it is revealed that the Kildane Standing Stones have been associated with the occult for a long time. The stones are actually a very significant location in the history of the series, as moving on into the early 1850s, a very large silver deposit was discovered. The resulting industry would not only result in a railway being built to reach the newly dubbed dig site, but to the unexpected discovery of sentient engines. It wouldn't take long for the scientific community to descend on the site and to get to the root of the discovery. Silver. More specifically, Sodor silver is unique from all other metals on Earth because no other metal is capable of granting any vehicle sentience. In the wake of this, the Sodor government would cordon off the area for exclusive control and distribution. Because of this, Great Britain would be given exclusive rights to the creation of sentient vehicles through a process which would later be dubbed silver plating. However, known by very few, this would set in motion the events of the series. Now, for centuries, many people had called Sodor home. In ancient times, before the introduction of Christianity to the island, many people believed that Sodor silver possessed mystical properties. Though they had long died out, a small following would persist, and they were not too happy when the government took control of all the Sodor silver. After this, they would lie in wait for an opportunity to strike. This would come in 1915 during the First World War, when an express engine carrying a mixed goods train was directed onto the Kildane industrial branch. The specifics of the incident were unknown, but their effects were plain as day. The then controller of the small railway would hide the engine in an old shed to protect her from the cult. He intended to let her out eventually, but would later make it his mission to hide her from them after learning the objective of their ritual. And since he never told anyone what he had done with the engine, the Sodor government would assume that it had hit a munitions train that had been diverted onto their line. Though, this explanation remains controversial to this day. In other important events that happened during the Great War, Stafford would be assigned as the official ROD shunting engine at the Kildane dig site in 1917, though he would not be silver-plated until 1923. Also, Smudger would arrive on the island on November 9, 1918, while en route to the Western Front, but would later be sold to the MSR as surplus after the war's end. However, improper gauging would lead to his repurposing as a stationary pump in 1929. Another important event that would happen in this time frame would be the discovery of Godred's fate in 1922. Opening on January 1, 1900, the Coldy-Fail Railway is a staple tourist attraction that remains open to this day. Though it boasts an impressive safety record, there was a single accident on the line prior to its opening, the results of which would result in the permanent immobilization of its number 1 engine. Following a nasty accident, Godred had been damaged beyond repair. Fearing how this would affect the line's opening, the accident will be covered up. Following the death of the line's owner, it was revealed that Godred, though still alive, had been cannibalized for parts, later resulting in his death. The political fallout of this event would result in the British Parliament passing new regulations aimed at protecting the rights of sentient vehicles. These new laws would prohibit the scrapping of sentient engines while they were still alive, granting them equal rights to their owners despite still being considered property. However, there would still be some difficulties enforcing these laws in some areas. Around this same time, an MSR engine named John was sold to the Kildane Industrial Railway after the disappearance of the railway's second narrow-gauge engine. He isn't a character you see much of in the series, but he is another significant character. He would later befriend the daughter of the Kildane Industrial Railway's owner, and together they would cause the mine collapse that would result in the mine's closing. Jezebel, having long been a follower of the cult's principles, wanted to find Molly so that she could complete the ritual and gain its power. But she and John had been misled about Molly's true location, and were subsequently trapped in the mine. Upon discovering his daughter's intentions, the mine owner would hide Molly in a secret cave in the United States, where he would live out the rest of his days in hiding, along with his son Burnett. Around this same time, the British government would send an expedition to the Arctic Circle. The finer details of the expedition remain classified to this day, but during the expedition, a very significant object would be discovered, the magic mirror. More on her later. It was also around this time that strange activity began to be reported around the Kildane dig site. This would result in the gradual increase of security personnel throughout the years. The last major event to take place in the mid-30s would be the Flying Kipper crash, which resulted in Henry being sent away to Crewe for an extensive refit. Following this, the world would be plunged into the bleakest period in human history, simply referred to as the War. The Second World War was a conflict fought between September 1st, 1939 and November 11th, 1946. Sodor, for the most part, would be spared the worst of the conflict, though it would briefly find itself at the front during Operation Sea Lion, a failed and poorly planned invasion of Sodor in late 1941. It was during this battle that Rosie would arrive on Sodor and see combat in a coastal artillery battalion before being relocated to the Kildane dig site for munition storage. Though facing occasional bombing raids, the rest of the war would pass Sodor by in relative peace. It was also during this time that 2 new ships would be named in Sodor's honor, the HMS King Gondred I and the HMS Sudrick. Before this point, a single Towns-class destroyer, known as the HMS Elsbridge, had been given such a distinction. The HMS Elsbridge already had a storied history before the war even began. A survivor of the Halifax explosion and the previously mentioned Arctic expedition, the ship would serve dutifully in the Mediterranean during the war. However, the ship would be lost at sea to unknown causes in 1941. However, it is rumored to have been sighted off the coast of Toronto Harbor in 1942. It was also during the war that both Axis and Allies would begin encountering strange lights over the night sky during sorties. Following the war, they would continue to be sighted all around the globe, but they would appear most frequently on Sodor. In order to cover up the reason for the lights, a fictionalized account of the wreck of the express engine was circulated. It should be noted that though the story did happen, the darker causes were not known, meaning the MOD was completely unaware of the cult's existence at this time. Following this, in 1955, a visiting clergyman with his family would go on a camping trip in the mountains of Sodor. During this time, Jezebel would escape and lure the Reverend's family away from him. It's unknown what she did, but it would result in the birth of a new threat on Sodor, the Lost One. However, she wasn't strong enough to begin her work just yet. She would lie dormant for some time and would be passed over in the nationwide searches. Locals would place the blame for the disappearance on isolated members of the cult. The government would oblige these concerns by rounding up the remaining members and destroying many books and artifacts in an event commonly referred to as the crackdowns. It was also after this point that the Reverend dedicated his life to fighting the evil forces that had taken his family, mainly through prayer. Roughly 15 years passed before the first events of the series took place. Starting on October 31st, 1971, Henry the Green Engine would see strange lights in the Kildane forest. He would relate this to all of the engines at the shed later that night. Edward would then relate the abridged story of the express engine's wreck. This would deeply trouble Henry for a few days before he was called to carry the Duke and Duchess home following the careless actions of visiting Diesel. That night, Henry would go to confront the lights, but he himself would be challenged by the visiting Diesel, who had followed him into the woods. However, the Diesel would strike one of the lights, drawing their ire. Henry never saw what happened, but it wasn't pretty nonetheless. Following this, the MOD would swoop in to secure the area. Henry would try to escape before being caught, but was cornered by a red light when it appeared right in front of him. He woke up the next morning in the Duke and Duchess's shed with no idea how he got there. The events in the forest were never publicly divulged, along with the fate of the Diesel. The British government would go to extreme lengths to erase any traces of him from the public eye, and the entire location of the incident was fenced off. Following this, in 1975, Gordon and Oliver would go missing. Despite an exhaustive search, no traces were found. Edward, however, would see Gordon sneaking through the yards at Brendam and followed him to the old lead mine on Thomas's branch line. There, he would see Oliver appear alongside Gordon, and they both disappeared into a mine shaft. A light would then start to glow from inside the shaft. It was there that Edward and his crew fled the yard, leaving a cross on the tracks to ward off whatever they had seen. The next morning, the entire mine had been closed down and fenced off. The official reason was safety concerns and bankruptcy. However, in reality, the Lost One had begun to enact her plan. Sometime afterwards, the Flying Scotsman would officially replace Gordon as the NWR's head express locomotive, even being repainted in honor of his brother. Sometime later, a military transport plane would crash in the mountains, the cause of which is unknown, but what is known is that one of the objects the plane was carrying would land next to the long-forgotten Smudger. This object was the previously mentioned Magic Mirror, as dubbed by the MOD. Given Smudger's multi-decade isolation, he was quick to make friends. The next day, Smudger would be found by a search party headed by Sir Robert Normanby. Though their primary goal was to locate Duke, they would be glad to recover Smudger as well. Wanting to have the mirror safe, Smudger would ask Sir Robert to take care of her during his restoration. Sir Normanby, who I like to think of as the Ned Flanders of rich people, obliged this request. After this, Smudger would be approached by Proteus and warned to guard the mirror. And after roughly 1 month of restoration, Sir Normanby would return her to Smudger. During this time, Smudger would be renamed Stanley, also befriending Duncan, who would later catch Smudger talking to the mirror. Smudger would talk his way out of it by convincing him that it was a special video recorder gifted to him by Sir Robert Normanby. This would work a little too well, because Duncan would later drop the mirror off Reneus Viaduct while trying to get a nice recording for Smudger. This would be a blessing in disguise, because the MOD had been tipped off of the mirror's location, and later raided the shed. That night, Duke would tell a fictionalized recounting of Smudger's time on the MSR. Many of the details of the story were correct, but mixed up. Whether it be from bad memory or intentional misinformation on the part of the manager is left to viewer interpretation. Following this exchange, Smudger would retreat to the works to spend the night, where he would tell Duncan his secret identity and solidify their friendship. It was also there that Smudger would witness Toad being taken by Oliver, and we got our first clear look at the Lost One. But those weren't the only events of the evening. With no mirror found and the Lost One's forces after it, the MOD had set up a perimeter. It was also during this that Colonel Peter Theodore Boomer would make his first appearance manning a machine gun at the perimeter. It isn't clear what happened, but the next evening, Duncan would be ambushed by John while trying to cross the Old Iron Bridge, but would be knocked off the bridge before he could reach him, possibly either by the magic mirror or Proteus. However, it's implied to be the former. Following this, Lapis, the being who had been trapped in the mirror, would make her first physical appearance to Smudger. She revealed that she had been freed from her prison when Duncan dropped her off the viaduct. She had tried to go home, but so much time had passed since the time she was imprisoned, there was no longer a home for her to return to. While they were discussing this, Duncan would appear. After a few moments of confusion, and Duncan being brought up to speed on what had happened, they would spend the rest of the night stargazing. Now, this part might need a little extra explaining. Lapis Lazuli is a character from the Cartoon Network series Steven Universe. She has the power to control water and was trapped in a magic mirror for most of the early series. The reason I decided to include her in this series was because I realized that she and Smudger actually have similar backstories. They were both essentially put into an inescapable prison due to reasons that weren't their fault. However, I do need to address some questions that this brings up. Primarily, does this mean Steven Universe is canon? Yes and no. While some of the characters may be canon, their backstories might be dramatically altered. Lapis, for instance, is shown to have been found by the British military in multiple flashbacks, and even implied to have been lost at sea at some point before washing up on the west coast of Sodor. She also mentioned how her home was desolate. That was in reference to where she was found, in the Arctic. However, I can't get into that now because I don't know if I will explore it in the future through a possible prequel series. However, there actually is a relation between her and the engines. I'm not going to go into depth and explain it, but many of you who are familiar with Steven Universe and the anatomy of gems may have already figured it out. As I stated previously, the mineral of Sodor silver is the only mineral capable of creating sentient locomotives. While it's more complicated in Steven Universe, that's also how the magical characters are created. Granted, there's much more to it than that in the lore, but I'm not going to go into that now. The main difference being that gems are created as is, while the engines still have to be constructed, assembled, and christened. However, unlike gems, they are 100% physical, meaning that if they sustain any major damage to anywhere other than their faces, they will not deform as they do in Steven Universe, forcing them to be repaired in a workshop. However, two traits that they very much share is that they will die or suffer permanent injuries if their gemstones or smokebox doors are damaged beyond repair or completely destroyed. They also share the ability to be corrupted, if my series indicates anything. Corruption in Steven Universe is an ailment that only affects gems. It essentially corrupts their minds and turns them into animalistic monsters that stalk the earth. Admittedly, I never intended for this parallel when I wrote Missing 411, but that's how it worked out narratively. However, corruption and Forest Horror's equivalent known as deception are distinct from one another. The different engines who accepted whatever Lady was offering would be changed into malevolent entities under her quasi-control. They even retained their previous memories and possibly even personalities, making them much more intelligent and dangerous than the corrupted gems. Moving on, soon after this, the remains of Gordon and Toad were found and later scrapped. Events would cool down for about 7 years with nothing much really happening until 1982. It's here that we are introduced to a character named Porter Percival. He was a porter who worked at Farquhar Station. He had a hobby of video recording, and this often drew the ire of Fred, a local delinquent. He also had a mutual acquaintance named Jezebel. Jezebel liked him, let's say, but more on her later. One night, Porter went into the woods to set up a camera overnight, but he was confronted by Fred. One thing led to another, and Porter bravely ran away, leaving his camera behind. The next morning, he would have it returned to him, but he would also notice a new truck in the yard which looked much different from the others, most notably with its lack of a facial area, and a particularly bad behavior. Later that night, he would have his footage rendered, where it was revealed that Fred, the bully, was the new truck, after being turned into one by Jezebel. This would trouble Porter, who would later show the footage to the Reverend. In turn, he would give him advice and a phone number. That night, Porter would again be approached by Jezebel in an attempt to lure him into the woods. Porter, however, wise to her tricks, would use the phone number that the Reverend gave him to call Colonel Peter Theodore, who would escort Porter to Skarloey to stay with his uncle. On the way, they encountered the MOD disposing of a line of deceived trucks, Fred included, and the remains of an ambushed convoy. With no choices left, they would decide to cross the railway bridge for safety. Being protected by Proteus, they would escape from Jezebel. However, Toby, who was coming up the line with a local goods train, was not so lucky, with it being revealed that Jezebel and Lady are the same person as they take Toby. Some people wonder why Proteus didn't help Toby. Well, there's only so much he can do when swaying a situation. He can help guide people away from danger, but how they react in danger is out of his control. So whatever happened after he left was completely up to Toby, who was nowhere to be found the next morning. The revelation of this would deeply sadden the Fat Controller, who would later die that morning of broken heart syndrome. In response to this, Mr. Percival would take control of the NWR and send Thomas and Percy to the Peel Godred branch to help them grieve. However, Their time there would be less than comfortable due to the growing disagreement between the two and an ongoing excavational program being undergone by the MOD, later resulting in the destruction of the standing stones. The stress brought on by the activity and Percy's response would cause a large fight between the two. Percy would disappear with Toby's remains being discovered close by. It was in this episode that the characters taken by the Lost One were first referred to as deceived. That is meant to imply partially how she is able to gain more minions. Godred's ghost also made an appearance in this episode as a warning to Thomas to appreciate what he has before he loses it. Perhaps he was speaking from experience. We might never know. Roughly 1 week later, Diesel would be sent to the Little Western so that Ryan could be sent to the Farquhar branch. During this visit, Diesel is subject to rude treatment from all but Douglas and Scruffy, the latter of whom he develops a strong friendship with. But as the days go on, Diesel begins to notice a certain unease in Scruffy's demeanor. It is explained that after Oliver pulled Scruffy apart, he never truly recovered, and still holds a deep-seated fear of Oliver. Oliver, for the worst part, never got over that inciting incident either, and during a large storm would try to kill Scruffy after successfully deceiving Duck and Donald and luring Diesel onto an isolated pier. The plan was to kill Scruffy using his best friend to do it, but due to a great timing and a little bit of prayer, salvation would come in the form of Warship, the Diesel, though it wouldn't stop the pier from collapsing under their weight. Following this, Mr. Percival would begin buying up engines to replace the ones that had gone missing, one of which would be Arthur, who would arrive on the island in December. It was here that he was paired with James and sent to work on the Kirk Ronan branch, with the most reliable engine being given a special privilege of taking a special train. James would work hard at this, but no matter what he did, something would go wrong. Eventually, he would be placed in the works while Arthur and Emily would gain the privilege of taking the special train. After they left, James would be sent to take a coal train to Kirk Ronan, but little did anybody know that many of the trucks on James's train were comprised of deceived trucks. Warship would follow James to do the best to ensure his safety, but would lose James after crashing into the tail end of his train. Later that night, Arthur would be directed into the woods by Proteus to save James. Together they would both escape through a pair of magic buffers onto the Kildane Industrial Line, where Warship would save them both from a deceived Donald before escorting them to Barrow and befriending James. That following spring, a Diesel on trial with the number D40125 would discover the aftermath of the events of Henry's Forest. The revelation of this would profoundly change his outlook on the island and results in a firm friendship with Henry through their shared experiences. In terms of the supernatural, while this did give some important backstory to the primary story arc of Forest Horrors, this episode probably had the least supernatural elements at play out of all the episodes in the series. For those of you wondering what D40 saw, it is implied that it was the remains of D261. For those of you asking what was behind the lights in Henry's Forest, it's never actually been stated what caused them, including in this video. Yes, I have stated where they have been seen, but not their origin. There is technically a third installment of Henry's Forest on the channel called Uhu, and it serves as a prequel episode to help give additional context to their existence. Following Old Stuckup, during the early summer of 1983, a string of accidents would beset the SKR, mainly caused by Ivo Hugh from the surface. In reality, they were actually being orchestrated by Jezebel, much like how she did with James. You see, Lapis, the woman who had been trapped in the magic mirror, is a being capable of flight. Ivo Hugh had been seeing her, and Jezebel knew that no one would believe him. She was essentially trying to repeat the process of Percy and James, but didn't count on Sir Normby and Splodge, who inadvertently killed John, the engine who had been with Jezebel since the beginning. It isn't clear why exactly Ivo Hugh was targeted, but it was possibly a ploy to try and deceive Lapis further down the road, or sabotage MOD operations in Skarloey. Skarloey Lake military base is considered the epicenter of MOD operations on Sodor. The incident would be important because it was the catalyst of Mr. Percival looking for a successor to run the NWR, and it would also see the birth of Nero, who was an engine created by melting down the remains of Gordon and John to lure the last of her victims into her lair. The episode would also establish that there was a vandal on the island who was damaging old and abandoned property. This was George. Though it wasn't explicitly stated, it was implied. This will be very important moving forward. Roughly a few weeks later, Mr. Percival would go on a business trip to finalize the transfer of the NWR to Bertram Topham Hatt, the estranged son of the late controller. During this time, despite previous statements, Mr. Percival would leave the responsibility of managing the railway to his nephew Porter, who was previously managing the SKR in his absence. This made it easy for Nero to pose as a new transfer and get close to Thomas. During this time, Hank and his crew were visiting the island. Hank and Edward would decide to do their best to get to the bottom of the mystery by asking around. Meanwhile, Lily, the granddaughter of Burnett Stone and the daughter of Hank's driver, would visit the island along with them. Back in Oregon, Burnett, with some help, had also been fixing up Molly to running condition in a hidden workshop on his land. While this was going on, the final ploy of the Lost One's plan was put into effect. After knocking Warship out of action, he was put in a position to tell Edward about the buffers in the hopes of getting help to stop her. But immediately after this, Edward was hit by Murdoch and killed, but not before passing the information on to Henry. Nero would then tell Thomas about what Henry had told the others, and along with Lily and Douglas, they would set off to rescue their friends, allowing them to easily be trapped inside the lair of the Lost One. After being confronted by Percy and being betrayed by Douglas, Thomas would escape into the leftover mines that Jezebel had been trapped in. After this, everyone would catch on to the missing persons and quickly move to rescue them. Mr. Percival would even return home early, where he would reveal that Nero was never the new engine, but Ginty. Warship would also confront Nero, who would reveal that he had caused Edward's death by fooling the signalman, and then he revealed that the deceived would strike the ironworks where James was. Though all but one of the present engines would survive, Warship would never know of James's fate before his death. Part of the frequent deaths and disappearances was a scheme by Lady to get him out of his right state of mind, ensuring her victory and the guilt for the death and endangerment of others on Warship's conscience. But she still had to actually capture either Thomas or Molly to win, and he would manage to evade her until reaching Muffle Mountain with the unexpected arrival of the coal truck Donald bumped through the buffers, which was also the one that Thomas bumped through the buffers last Christmas. You should just watch this series if this is confusing. There are a lot of background information and Easter eggs that are easier to notice than to explain. But anyways, Lily would find her grandpa and convince him to steam up Molly with the special coal in the truck and help Thomas, while Thomas convinced Douglas, who had been tasked by the Lost One to catch Thomas, to escape with him. They would all meet up and escape from the Lost One at the last second, slamming through the last of the magic buffers just as George was destroying them. It should also be stated that he destroyed the buffers earlier in the film, trapping Thomas, Donald, and Lily in the forest, as well as the buffers Thomas would have run into with his runaway, and even the buffers Nero would have escaped through when being chased by Warship. Needless to say, George was confused to what just happened, and the others didn't care. Soon after this, Warship would join the chase and hamper her efforts as the MOD gathered their forces together in one last effort to put an end to the nightmare. They would divert the Lost One to a prepared cliff face. Though the Lost One would stop in time, Warship would ensure that she didn't escape by ramming her into the gap at the cost of his own life. Her attempt to emotionally manipulate him only motivated him for revenge. After this, Proteus would appear one last time to the Lost One and offer her one last chance to accept the Lord and go to heaven. Even though she still tried to kill him, he still cared for her and for her father. Though she would reject this offer, Proteus would still forgive her. Immediately after Proteus disappeared, the MOD would surround Jezebel, ensuring an end to the problem. After this, the railway would regain a sense of normality, with Bertram Topham Hatt taking over the NWR. And Hank, along with Burnett, Lily, and Patch, returned home to the United States. Molly would still be owned by Burnett, but would elect to stay on the island. It should be stated that due to the trauma she endured in 1915, she lost the ability to speak, hence why she doesn't talk in the episode. Yes, I know Edward suffered worse, but he died immediately after, and she lived for 70 years in a coma. It isn't known exactly what the MOD did with the lost one's body. All I can say is that she was taken care of. The story ends with a post-credits scene on Halloween night, with Percy rushing by the sheds, much like in the story Thomas told in the TV episode Ghost Train, making Thomas live with the decisions he made. It should also be said that if you did not see a deceived die, they're still alive, apart from Toad or Toby. This includes both engine and trucks. Due to their lowered threat, trucks are no longer hunted by the military, though they are monitored. It was also after this that the Reverend retired from his quest. Though he would occasionally assist the Colonel and the MOD, he would spend the rest of his days participating in clerical duties across the island.